When Jack takes in a lost, starving dog, he has no idea that simple act of kindness will pull him into a dangerous mystery. A knock on the door from a mysterious stranger claiming to know the dog's past sets off a chain of events that could cost Jack everything. What happened to the missing son? And why are shadowy figures tracking them through the woods? Stay tuned for a gripping journey where trust is shattered, secrets unravel, and every step could be their last. Jack pulled the collar of his jacket tighter against the chilly wind as he made his way home from the shop. The town was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that comes before a heavy rain. He hated these long days at work, his hands sore from fixing old engines and his boots coated in grime from hours spent on concrete floors. All he wanted was to get home, heat up some leftovers, and collapse on the couch. But as he rounded the corner to his apartment building, something made him pause. Just ahead, beneath the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, a small dog stood shivering. The animal looked out of place, wet fur clinging to its thin frame, eyes wide with confusion. Jack could see its ribs pressing against its muddy coat, as though it hadn't eaten in days. He stopped, watching for a moment, wondering if the dog belonged to anyone nearby. But there were no owners calling for it, no leash dragging behind it, just the dog, alone and trembling in the cold. It glanced nervously in his direction before trying to dart off, but its steps were unsteady, as if exhaustion had taken hold. Jack knelt down and called softly, "Hey, buddy. You lost?" The dog froze, ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Jack noticed it had a collar, worn and frayed, but no tag to give a name or address. He sighed, glancing up at the sky where thick clouds had started gathering. The rain wasn't far off, and he knew if he walked away now, the dog wouldn't make it through the night. With a slow, careful movement, Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the half-eaten sandwich he'd planned to finish for dinner. The dog's nose twitched at the smell, and its cautious eyes followed Jack's every movement. "Here," Jack whispered, tearing off a small piece and placing it on the ground. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." The dog hesitated at first, taking a few tentative steps forward before snatching the bread. Jack smiled as it wolfed the food down in seconds, glancing back up at him with wary eyes. "That's all I have, sorry," Jack said softly, standing up. "But you can come with me if you want. I've got a warm place." The dog didn't need any more convincing. It followed him cautiously, keeping a few steps behind as if still unsure whether to trust him. Jack led the way to his small apartment, opening the door and letting the dog step inside. The place was modest, a beat-up couch, a small kitchen with dishes piled in the sink, and a flickering TV that Jack left on more for company than entertainment. He grabbed an old towel from the bathroom and gently dried the dog, who flinched but didn't resist. "You're not much to look at, are you?" Jack muttered, noticing the grime on the dog's fur. But the creature wagged its tail just once and curled up on the rug by the couch, as though it had finally found a place to rest. Jack watched it for a moment, a strange warmth settling over him. It had been a long time since he'd had anything, or anyone, waiting for him at home. And though he hadn't planned on bringing a stray animal into his life, it somehow felt like the right thing to do. He let out a tired breath, ran a hand through his messy hair, and stretched out on the couch, pulling a blanket over himself. The dog shifted slightly, resting its head on its paws, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. "Guess you're staying the night," Jack mumbled, his voice trailing off as sleep tugged at him. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Inside, for the first time in what felt like years, Jack drifted off to sleep with a sense of quiet comfort. Jack stirred awake the next morning to the sound of rain still pattering lightly on the window. The apartment felt unusually warm, and as he blinked himself into awareness, he noticed the dog was still curled up on the rug, breathing softly. "Morning, buddy," Jack muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He swung his legs off the couch and stretched, groaning as his joints popped. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's voice, but it didn't move from its spot. Jack shuffled into the kitchen, started the coffee machine, and opened the fridge, scowling at the pitiful collection of leftovers. His mind wandered as he cracked an egg into the pan. What was he supposed to do with this dog? Taking it to the shelter crossed his mind, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the dog had relaxed the moment it entered his apartment, as if it had been waiting for a place to call safe. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and glanced at the animal, now lazily thumping its tail on the floor. "We'll figure it out, right?" he said, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to convince, himself or the dog. Just as he brought the mug to his lips, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Jack froze. Nobody ever came by his place unannounced. He wasn't close with his neighbors, and the only visitor he could expect was the landlord at the end of the month, and it wasn't that time yet. The dog lifted its head, ears perked, and let out a soft, low growl. Jack set his coffee down slowly, wiping his hands on his shirt. Another knock followed, sharp and deliberate. Jack's stomach tightened. Something about the way it sounded, a deliberate, unhurried knock, set him on edge. He crossed the room, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He opened the door cautiously, expecting a delivery person or a neighbor needing something. But what he saw on the other side made his breath hitch. A tall man stood there, wearing an old trench coat, his gray hair damp from the rain. The man's eyes were sharp, but there was a weariness in them, a heaviness that suggested he had carried a burden for far too long. "Jack Miller?" the man asked, his voice low and even, as though they had met before. Jack's brow furrowed. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" The man gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Walter. I think you found something that belongs to me." Jack frowned, glancing back over his shoulder at the dog. The animal had risen to its feet, tail stiff, and was watching the door intently. Jack turned back to Walter, suspicion flickering in his mind. "The dog?" Jack asked, narrowing his eyes. Walter gave a small nod, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Yeah, that dog's been missing for a while." Jack folded his arms across his chest. Something about this didn't sit right. "You're telling me this dog belongs to you? Doesn't have a tag, doesn't seem to recognize you." Walter's expression faltered for a moment, a shadow passing across his face. "Not exactly mine," he admitted, his voice softer now. "But it belonged to someone important to me. My son." Jack's defenses stayed up. He didn't know this man, and people didn't usually knock on doors in the rain, looking for lost dogs. There were too many unanswered questions swirling in his mind. "How'd you even know it was here?" Jack asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Walter hesitated for a second, his gaze lowering to the ground. "Been following this dog for the past week," he finally said. "It's been running scared all over town. I lost track of it until late last night. Then someone saw you take it in." Jack's jaw tightened. He hated the idea that someone had been watching him, but the man's story didn't feel like a lie. There was an exhaustion in Walter's voice, the kind that only came from searching too long for something you were afraid you'd never find. "So, what's the story?" Jack asked, still keeping his guard up. "Why's a stray dog tied to your son?" Walter glanced up, rain dripping from the brim of his coat. His eyes were tired but filled with something close to hope, a fragile, flickering hope that made Jack's stomach twist. "It's a long story," Walter said quietly, "but I think this dog might help me find out what happened to him." Jack stood silent for a moment, the weight of the man's words settling in the space between them. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a lost dog. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than Jack had anticipated. "You mind if I come in?" Walter asked, his voice softening. "We could talk inside. There's a lot I need to tell you." Jack hesitated, glancing back at the dog, who stared at Walter with quiet, guarded eyes. It wasn't often that Jack trusted strangers, or anyone for that matter, but something told him that whatever story Walter carried, it was important. With a sigh, Jack stepped back and opened the door wider. "All right," he muttered, "but you better have one hell of a good explanation." Walter gave a slow nod and stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. as Jack closed the door behind them. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life, once so predictable and lonely, had just taken a sharp and unexpected turn. Jack motioned toward the small kitchen table, and Walter took a seat, his trench coat draped over the back of the chair. The dog, still cautious, sat a few feet away, watching Walter with guarded curiosity. Jack leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting for the man to start explaining. Walter ran a hand through his damp gray hair, sighing deeply as if the weight of the past few years was pressing on him. "My son." His name was Ryan, Walter began. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of sorrow. "He disappeared almost 2 years ago. One day he just vanished. No note, no warning." Jack remained silent, his face impassive but his mind churning. People disappeared all the time, he thought. Some left on purpose. Others got lost. Either way, it wasn't often they came back. Walter continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if replaying the memory in his mind. Ryan was struggling. Depression, mostly. He'd lost his job, drifted away from friends, and stopped answering calls. It was like I was watching my son fade away, little by little. Then one day, he was just gone. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unsure how much sympathy to show. He wasn't great at handling other people's grief. He barely managed his own. "So, where does the dog fit into all this?" Jack asked, nodding toward the animal, who now lay on the floor, ears perked and alert. Walter glanced down at the dog, a bittersweet smile flickering across his tired face. "This dog, his name is Ace. He was the only thing Ryan held onto when everything else slipped away." Walter's voice wavered slightly, but he cleared his throat and continued. "I gave Ace to Ryan when he was going through his worst. Thought maybe it'd give him a reason to get out of bed in the mornings, you know? Someone to take care of." Jack nodded slowly. He could understand the logic. A dog had a way of grounding people, giving them something to focus on when life felt too heavy. He glanced at Ace, who rested his chin on his paws, his eyes never leaving Walter. "When Ryan disappeared," Walter went on, "Ace vanished too. I looked everywhere, filed a missing persons report, searched shelters, even hired a private investigator. Nothing. Just nothing." Jack blew out a slow breath, starting to piece things together. "And now, 2 years later, the dog shows up here," he said, half to himself. "That's one hell of a coincidence." Walter gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Yeah. Some people would call it fate. I'm not sure what to call it. All I know is that if Ace is still alive, there's a chance Ryan could be too." Jack's skepticism flickered, but he held it back. He didn't believe in fate or miracles, but he'd seen enough strange things in life to know that sometimes the universe didn't play by the rules. "So, you think this dog can lead you to your son?" Jack asked, his voice laced with doubt. Walter rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted but determined. "I don't know. Maybe. But Ace is the only lead I've had in 2 years. I have to believe there's a reason he's here, and I have to follow it." Jack leaned against the counter, processing everything. It was a lot to take in, too much, really. A missing son, a lost dog, and a grieving father clinging to the hope that somehow, somewhere, there were answers. It was the kind of story Jack would have dismissed as nonsense if not for the fact that Ace was sitting right there in his apartment, as real as the rain tapping against the windows. "What do you want from me?" Jack asked finally, his tone guarded. He wasn't sure where this was heading, but he knew better than to get tangled up in other people's problems without knowing exactly what they expected from him. Walter met Jack's gaze, his expression both weary and resolute. "I don't want anything from you," Walter said slowly. "But I was hoping you'd let me spend some time with Ace. Maybe he'll remember something, lead me somewhere I haven't looked." Jack stared at Walter for a long moment, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to shut the door on this entire situation, send Walter on his way, and take Ace to the shelter. He wasn't equipped to deal with missing persons or broken families. He was just a mechanic, living in a rundown apartment, trying to make it through each day with as little trouble as possible. But then Jack looked down at Ace, really looked at him. The dog wasn't just any stray. There was something different about him, something Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way Ace's eyes flickered with recognition when he looked at Walter. Or maybe it was the way the dog had curled up so comfortably on Jack's floor, as if he belonged there. With a sigh, Jack finally relented. "All right," he muttered. "You can stick around for a bit, but if the dog doesn't lead us anywhere, you're on your own." Walter gave a small, grateful nod. "That's all I can ask." Jack pushed off the counter and grabbed his coat from the chair. "Come on," he said, heading for the door. "Let's see if this dog remembers anything." Walter stood and followed, his expression guarded but hopeful. Ace sprang to his feet, tail wagging, ready to follow them both. As Jack opened the door and stepped out into the drizzling morning, a strange feeling settled over him. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. It felt a little like hope. The rain had lightened to a mist, drifting lazily over the streets as Jack, Walter, and Ace stepped out into the quiet morning. The town was still waking up. Closed storefronts with open signs flipped the wrong way, empty sidewalks glistening from the rain. Jack pulled his hood over his head, glancing at Walter, who looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Ace padded along beside them, his tail flicking now and then as he sniffed the air, scanning his surroundings with a careful attention that made Jack uneasy. "Where are we even going?" Jack muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. Walter shrugged, wiping a raindrop off his brow. "I don't know yet. Let's see if Ace takes the lead." Jack raised an eyebrow. The idea of following a stray dog through town sounded ridiculous, but then again, this whole situation was ridiculous. He gave a low whistle, and Ace looked up, ears alert, before suddenly taking off down the street in a purposeful trot. "Guess we're following the dog," Jack said dryly, quickening his pace to keep up. Walter chuckled under his breath, a sound that was more exhaustion than humor. "Looks like it." They walked for several blocks, the dog zigzagging through alleys and side streets, nose glued to the ground. Jack tried not to think too hard about what they were doing. It was easier just to move forward, step after step, with no particular plan in mind. He'd stopped questioning things hours ago, ever since Ace had shown up on his doorstep, bringing Walter and his tangled past along with him. Ace led them past the park, where children's swings swayed gently in the breeze. He sniffed the base of a tree, circled it once, then darted down another alley without hesitation. "This dog knows something," Walter murmured, more to himself than to Jack. "I can feel it." Jack said nothing, keeping his thoughts to himself. It wasn't that he believed the dog had some mystical sense of direction. It was just that, for some reason, it felt like Ace had been running toward something all along. And maybe they were finally going to find out what. The dog slowed near an old hardware store, sniffing around the doorway before trotting further down the street. Jack followed close behind, glancing at Walter as they walked side by side. "You said you gave Ace to your son," Jack said, breaking the silence. "What happened between them? Why would Ryan just take off?" Walter sighed, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ryan was dealing with more than he let on. He tried to hold it together for a while, but things fell apart faster than I could help him. Ace was supposed to be his anchor. He paused for a moment, his voice dropping. But I guess even that wasn't enough. Jack nodded, though he didn't push further. He wasn't one to pry into other people's wounds, especially not ones that still looked so raw. He kept his gaze on Ace, who was now heading toward the edge of town, his pace quickening with each step. They reached a part of the neighborhood that Jack rarely visited, a stretch of boarded-up shops and weather-beaten houses that had seen better days. It was the kind of place people went to when they wanted to be forgotten. Ace slowed as they approached an old, abandoned building. The windows were cracked, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. The faded remnants of a sign above the door suggested it had once been a cafe, but it had clearly been out of business for years. The dog sniffed around the entrance, his body tense with familiarity. He whimpered softly, his tail low, and pawed at the door as if trying to get inside. Walter's breath hitched. "He's been here before," he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "This is where Ryan must have stayed." Jack frowned, stepping closer to the door. "How can you be sure?" Walter knelt beside Ace, gently running a hand over the dog's head. "Look at him. He knows this place." Ace scratched at the door again, letting out a low, anxious whine. Jack exchanged a glance with Walter, then cautiously pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing the dark, musty interior of what had once been a small cafe. Chairs lay overturned, dust coated the counters, and broken glass glittered on the floor. Jack stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The air smelled stale, a mixture of damp wood and forgotten memories. Ace sniffed along the walls, his tail wagging cautiously as he explored the space. Walter followed, his eyes scanning the room like a man searching for something long lost. "He must have been here," he said, almost to himself. He had nowhere else to go. Jack walked further into the room, kicking aside a chair as he inspected the surroundings. His foot nudged something half buried beneath a pile of papers, and he crouched down to get a closer look. It was a photo, faded and crumpled, but still intact. Jack picked it up, brushing the dust away. The image was of a young man, smiling awkwardly at the camera, with Ace sitting by his side. Jack turned the photo toward Walter, who froze at the sight of it. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as if the air had been knocked out of him. "That's Ryan," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He was here." Jack glanced around the empty cafe, the weight of Walter's words settling heavily in the silence. Whatever had happened to Ryan, this place held part of the answer. And they weren't leaving until they found out what it was. Walter knelt by the photograph, holding it delicately in his hands as if it might dissolve under his touch. Jack watched him in silence, noticing how the old man's hands trembled slightly. It was clear that this small discovery, just a photo, meant more to Walter than anything Jack could fully understand. "He really was here," Walter murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought, after all this time, I thought maybe he was gone for good." Jack shifted uncomfortably but gave Walter the space he needed. Ace wandered further into the cafe, sniffing along the edges of the walls. His nose twitched, and every so often he let out a small whine, as if he too sensed traces of someone long gone. Jack glanced around the room, trying to think logically. "If Ryan stayed here," he said, his voice low and even, "there's got to be more. Something that tells us where he went after this." Walter nodded, still clutching the photo. "Ryan always kept a notebook," he said quietly. "He'd jot down everything, thoughts, places, ideas. If he left it behind, it could tell us what happened." Jack nodded. It made sense. People who drifted tended to hold on to small things, little anchors in a sea of chaos. Maybe Ryan's notebook was still here, waiting to be found. "All right," Jack muttered, scanning the room. "Let's split up. You check that side. I'll see if there's anything in the back." Walter gave a small nod, though his movements were slow and hesitant, as if he were afraid of finding too much or too little. Jack left him to search the front area and made his way toward the back of the cafe, where a door stood slightly ajar. Ace followed him, his paws silent against the dusty floor. Jack nudged the door open with his shoulder, revealing what used to be a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with old cans, cracked plates, and stacks of faded newspapers. Most of it looked untouched, as though the world outside had moved on while this place remained frozen in time. Ace sniffed along the edges of the room, his tail twitching nervously. Jack crouched down to sift through a box of crumpled receipts and forgotten trinkets. Nothing seemed particularly useful, just the remnants of a business that had been abandoned long ago. Just as Jack was about to give up, something caught his eye. A small notebook wedged between two dusty cans on the bottom shelf. He pulled it out, the cover brittle from years of neglect. The pages were warped and yellowed, but the writing inside was still legible. "Got something?" Jack called over his shoulder, holding up the notebook. Walter appeared in the doorway a moment later, his breath hitching when he saw the familiar notebook in Jack's hand. "That's it," Walter whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's Ryan's." Jack handed it over without a word. Walter opened the notebook slowly, flipping through the pages as if he were reading a letter from someone long lost. The handwriting was uneven and messy, the scrawl of someone whose thoughts had run too fast for his pen to keep up. Jack stood back, giving Walter the space he needed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them, the discovery of something tangible, a connection to Ryan after so much time spent searching in the dark. Walter skimmed through the pages, his lips moving silently as he read bits and pieces aloud. He stayed here for a while. Said he needed to get away. Didn't trust anyone anymore. Felt like he was being followed. Walter's voice broke slightly and he cleared his throat. But he said Ace kept him grounded, kept him from going under. Jack watched Walter carefully, noticing the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of the words. "What else does it say?" Walter flipped to the last entry, his eyes scanning the page. "It's short," he muttered. "Just says, 'I think they found me. If I leave Ace behind, he'll find someone to help.'" Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "They? Who's they?" Walter shook his head slowly, his face pale. "I don't know, but Ryan was always a little paranoid. Thought someone was after him, but I never knew if it was real or just something in his head." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, trying to make sense of it all. So Ryan thought he was in trouble, left Ace behind on purpose, hoping the dog would lead someone to him. He glanced down at Ace, who was sitting quietly by his side, his brown eyes filled with something Jack couldn't quite place. Walter nodded slowly, as if piecing together the same puzzle. "It sounds crazy, I know, but Ryan wasn't thinking clearly back then, and if he believed Ace could lead someone to him, maybe there's still a chance." Jack let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a missing dog anymore. It was about a man running from something, leaving behind fragments of his life in the hope that someone might pick them up and find him. "So what now?" Jack asked, glancing at Walter. "We found the notebook, but it doesn't tell us where Ryan went." Walter closed the notebook gently, his expression grim but determined. "No," he agreed. "But it tells us one thing. Ryan left Ace for a reason. And if he left clues behind, it means he wanted to be found." Jack looked down at Ace, who wagged his tail slowly, as if sensing that they were finally getting somewhere. "We're not done yet," Jack muttered, more to himself than to Walter. Walter nodded. "No," he whispered, tucking the notebook into his coat pocket. "We're just getting started." Ace stood up, tail wagging more eagerly now, as if he too knew the search wasn't over. Jack exchanged a glance with Walter, feeling a strange sense of purpose settle in his chest. "Let's go," Jack said quietly, leading the way back toward the front of the cafe. "There's more out there. We just have to keep looking." As they stepped back out into the misty morning, Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever Ryan had been running from, they were going to find the truth. And with Ace by their side, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The mist thickened as Jack, Walter, and Ace left the abandoned cafe behind. The streets stretched out like quiet rivers, with the occasional flicker of life behind windows, but no one seemed to notice or care about their movements. Jack walked with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his mind tangled in thoughts about Ryan's cryptic final note and the sense of danger lurking just out of reach. Ace led them with steady determination, nose low to the ground, as if retracing invisible footprints. Walter walked beside Jack, gripping Ryan's notebook inside his coat, as though holding it tightly would bring his son closer. Neither man spoke much. There was too much to process, and too many unanswered questions. "Any idea who they could be?" Jack asked after a long stretch of silence, his voice low. Walter shook his head, looking weary. "No idea. Ryan was always worried someone was watching him. Said things didn't add up, but I thought it was, just in his head." He hesitated, guilt flickering across his features. Maybe I should have listened more. Jack didn't respond. Regret had a way of creeping in at the worst moments, and Walter carried enough of it for both of them. Instead, Jack focused on Ace, who trotted ahead with purpose. The dog seemed to know something they didn't, and that gnawed at Jack's nerves. As they followed Ace deeper into the quieter part of town, Jack caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. A figure, distant, hooded, just a shadow slipping between two buildings. He stopped abruptly, causing Walter to nearly bump into him. "What?" Walter asked, alarmed by Jack's sudden halt. Jack narrowed his eyes, scanning the alley across the street, but the figure was already gone. A prickle of unease crept up his spine. "I thought I saw someone," he muttered. "Probably nothing." Walter stiffened, glancing over his shoulder as if the mere mention of someone watching them had reignited old fears. "Do you think—" "I don't know." Jack cut in quickly, not wanting to jump to conclusions just yet. Could have been anyone. But the nagging feeling didn't leave. Jack had spent too many years learning how to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. Someone had been there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Ace barked suddenly, pulling their attention forward again. The dog darted down another narrow street, his pace quickening as if spurred by some unseen urgency. Jack cursed under his breath and jogged after him, with Walter close behind. The narrow street opened into a small park, a quiet, forgotten place with cracked benches and overgrown grass. Ace skidded to a stop near the base of a large oak tree, sniffing furiously at the ground. His tail wagged nervously and a low whine escaped his throat. Walter came to a breathless halt beside Jack, his face pale. "This place," he whispered. "Ryan used to bring Ace here all the time. Said it was one of the only places that felt peaceful." Jack frowned, scanning the empty park. It was eerie how quiet it felt, like a place that had been abandoned by the world long before they arrived. "So, why's Ace acting weird?" Jack muttered, glancing down at the dog, who was now pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. Walter's face tightened with worry. Maybe he smells something. Or someone. Jack didn't like the sound of that. He scanned the tree line, his muscles tense, every sense on high alert. The unsettling feeling from earlier returned, stronger this time. They weren't alone. Suddenly, Ace froze, his body stiff and alert, staring toward a cluster of bushes at the edge of the park. A moment later, the bushes rustled, and Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. "Stay back," Jack whispered sharply, putting a hand out to stop Walter. From the shadows, a figure emerged, slow and deliberate, as if waiting to be noticed. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his face. He stood just at the edge of the clearing, his hands tucked into his pockets, as though he had all the time in the world. Walter's breath hitched beside Jack. "Do you see him?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. Jack gave a tight nod, his hand instinctively reaching toward his pocket, though he had no weapon to grab. "Yeah, I see him." The man in the hoodie remained perfectly still, watching them with an unsettling calmness. For a moment, the park seemed frozen in time. No sounds, no movement, just the silent tension stretching between them. Then, without warning, the man gave a small, deliberate nod, almost as if to acknowledge them, and turned on his heel, disappearing back into the woods. Jack cursed under his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. "We need to go," he muttered, grabbing Walter's arm. "Now!" Walter looked dazed, as though the encounter had shaken something loose inside him. But he nodded quickly, and they both turned to follow Ace, who had already started running toward the far end of the park. As they hurried away from the clearing, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just stumbled into something far bigger than they could handle. Whoever that man was, he had been waiting for them, watching, lurking in the shadows like a predator waiting to strike. And Jack had the sinking suspicion that this was only the beginning. Jack's heart pounded as they hurried away from the park, the unsettling encounter with the hooded man leaving his nerves raw. Ace stayed close, his ears twitching with every sound, as if he expected danger at any moment. Walter stumbled along beside Jack, clutching Ryan's notebook as though it held the only lifeline to his son. They didn't slow until they were several blocks from the park, tucked behind a row of shuttered storefronts. Jack leaned against a lamppost, catching his breath. Walter bent over, hands on his knees, his breathing heavy and uneven. "Who the hell was that guy?" Jack asked, glancing back toward the park, his gut still twisting with unease. Walter shook his head. "I don't know, but Ryan always believed someone was following him. He used to talk about people watching him, tracking him." He hesitated, regret flickering across his face. "I thought it was just paranoia. I didn't believe him." Jack let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe it wasn't. Walter's eyes clouded with guilt, and he opened the notebook again, flipping through the worn pages. There has to be something in here, something that makes sense. His fingers trembled as he skimmed through Ryan's messy handwriting, trying to make sense of the scattered thoughts and notes. Jack crouched beside Ace, scratching the dog behind the ears in an attempt to calm both the animal and himself. "If someone's following us, we need to figure out why, fast." Walter nodded grimly, turning another page. He kept writing about patterns, weird patterns he saw in the people around him. Strangers who showed up more than once, cars parked in the same spot day after day. Walter pointed at a line scrawled across the page. "They aren't coincidences. It's deliberate." Jack frowned, trying to piece together the fragments. He thought they were tracking him. "Yeah," Walter whispered, his expression bleak. "And now it feels like they're watching us too." Jack pushed off the lamppost, pacing as his mind raced. So Ryan goes off the grid, leaves Ace behind, and someone's been following the dog ever since? Walter nodded slowly. That's what it seems like. If Ryan wanted Ace to find help, maybe he hoped the dog would lead the right person to him, or at least someone who could figure out what was going on. Jack felt the weight of that responsibility settle over him like a heavy coat. He wasn't sure he wanted to be part of this twisted puzzle, but now it was too late to walk away. He glanced at Ace, who wagged his tail cautiously, as if waiting for what would happen next. "We need more than just this notebook," Jack muttered. "There has to be something else. A place, a name, anything that tells us where Ryan went." Walter flipped back to the final page, where Ryan had scribbled one last entry. His finger traced the jagged handwriting. It just says, "If they catch me, look for the signal." Walter glanced up, confusion etched across his face. "What the hell does that mean?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He pulled out his phone and checked the map. "Where else could Ryan have gone?" Jack asked. If he stayed at that cafe for a while, he had to have other places nearby, places he felt safe. Walter thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "There's one place he used to talk about, a place just outside of town, an old cabin we used to visit when he was a kid." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You think he went back there?" Walter shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, but if Ryan needed somewhere to hide, somewhere off the grid, that cabin would be it." Jack glanced down at Ace, who gave a small, eager bark, as if to say that was the right direction. Jack sighed. "All right," he muttered. "Looks like we're going to the woods." Walter's expression tightened, and he tucked the notebook back into his coat. "It's about an hour's walk from here. Not far, but remote enough that no one would find him unless they were looking." Jack gave a small nod, his mind racing. If Ryan had gone to the cabin, it could mean one of two things. Either he was still out there, waiting to be found, or someone else had already beaten them to it. "Let's move," Jack said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If someone's following us, we need to stay ahead of them." Walter nodded, and together they started down the empty streets, with Ace leading the way once again. Jack's pulse thrummed with unease, his thoughts swirling with every possibility. None of them good. As they made their way out of town, the streets gave way to winding dirt roads and thick woods where the air felt heavier, like it carried old secrets. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches whispering quietly above them. The cabin, Jack thought, might hold answers, or it might hold something far worse. Whatever they found, there was no turning back now. With Ace trotting faithfully ahead, they pressed on, the weight of Ryan's story trailing behind them like a shadow. The dirt path narrowed as the trees closed in around them, their branches swaying in the cold breeze. Jack kept his eyes on the trail ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure no one was following. Ace trotted steadily at the front, his nose twitching as if he recognized where they were going. Walter lagged slightly behind, fatigue etched into every line of his face. His breath came in short bursts, and his eyes stayed locked on the trail, as though sheer determination alone would get him to the cabin. "You okay?" Jack asked, slowing his pace to match Walter's. Walter gave a faint nod. "Yeah, just a lot of memories. Ryan used to love this place when he was little." Jack grunted in acknowledgement, focusing again on the path. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew that whatever nostalgia Walter felt now would mean nothing if they didn't find real answers. The trail twisted and turned, climbing slowly until it flattened out into a small clearing. At the edge of the clearing stood the cabin, a weathered one-story building with a sagging roof and moss creeping up its wooden walls. The windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. "There it is," Walter whispered, a mix of relief and fear in his voice. Jack stopped a few steps away from the cabin, scanning the area. Something about the place felt off, not just abandoned but forgotten, as though it had been untouched by time. Ace stood at attention, ears perked and tail stiff, his body tense. Jack approached the front steps cautiously, his boots crunching over dried leaves. "Stay here with Ace," he muttered to Walter, keeping his voice low. "I'll check it out." Walter nodded, though he looked reluctant to stay behind. Jack gave Ace a brief pat on the head, then pushed the door open with the toe of his boot. It creaked loudly, and Jack winced at the sound, stepping inside with careful, measured steps. The interior of the cabin was dim, with beams of light slipping through the cracks in the walls. Dust floated lazily in the air, and the floor was littered with old newspapers, empty cans, and bits of debris. Jack's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he moved further into the room, searching for any sign that someone had been there recently. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, as if a fire had burned in the stove not too long ago. He knelt by the fireplace, running his fingers through the ashes. They were cold, but not ancient. Whoever had been here had left sometime within the past few days. Jack scanned the room, his gaze landing on a small table pushed against the wall. On it, he saw something that made his chest tighten: a stack of folded clothes, a flashlight, and a canteen of water. "Ryan," Jack whispered under his breath, though he knew it was foolish to say the name aloud. There was no one here now. But the neatly arranged belongings suggested that someone had been, and that someone had planned to come back. He moved toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom. The bed was unmade, the blanket half draped over the mattress as if someone had left in a hurry. On the nightstand was a small black notebook. Jack's heart pounded as he picked it up. The cover was plain, worn from use, and the pages inside were filled with cramped handwriting, Ryan's handwriting. Jack scanned the entries, flipping through quickly until something caught his eye. "I saw them again today. They know I'm here. If I disappear, it means they've found me. But if Ace is still alive, there's still a way." Jack cursed under his breath, gripping the notebook tighter. "Damn it, Ryan, what the hell were you mixed up in?" Before he could read further, a noise from outside made him freeze, a faint rustling just beyond the cabin walls. Jack slipped the notebook into his coat pocket and moved silently back toward the front door. His heart raced, every muscle in his body tensed for action. As he reached the entrance, he saw Walter standing just outside, clutching Ace's collar with both hands. "Someone's here," Walter whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. Jack stepped out onto the porch, scanning the clearing. At first, everything looked still, but then he saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a shadow slipping between the trees, barely visible. "They followed us," Jack muttered grimly, his hand instinctively going to the pocket where Ryan's notebook rested. Walter's face paled. "What do we do?" Jack's mind raced. They couldn't stay at the cabin, it was too exposed, and whoever was out there knew where they were. But running blind into the woods wasn't an option either. "We need to move," Jack said firmly, grabbing Walter's arm. Stick close to me, and keep that notebook safe." Walter nodded, his grip tightening on Ace's collar. Jack led the way back down the trail, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. His pulse hammered in his ears, but he kept moving, step after step, determined not to let fear slow him down. As they disappeared into the dense trees, Jack knew one thing for sure. Whoever was out there wouldn't stop until they found what they were looking for, and neither would he. The forest closed in around them, thick with shadows and the smell of damp earth. Jack moved quickly, every sense on high alert. Ace trotted beside him, ears pinned back and tail low, as if sensing the danger that crept just behind them. Walter stumbled along, struggling to keep up, clutching Ryan's notebook like a lifeline. "You think they're still following us?" Walter panted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Jack gave a grim nod. "Yeah, I saw someone near the cabin. They're out there, and they're not far behind." The weight of that truth pressed heavily on both of them. Whoever had been lurking at the edge of the park had followed them to the cabin, and now they were being hunted through the woods. Jack scanned the trees ahead, his mind racing. "We need to lose them," he muttered. "If they catch us, we're done." Walter swallowed hard, his breath ragged. "What do they even want? The dog? The notebook?" "I don't know," Jack answered, frustrated. "But we can't stop to find out." Ace barked softly, nudging Jack's leg as if urging him to move faster. Jack gave the dog a quick pat, then motioned for Walter to keep going. "Stick with me," Jack ordered. "Stay quiet and don't fall behind." They pressed deeper into the forest, weaving through the thick underbrush and stepping carefully over fallen branches. Every so often Jack paused to listen, but all he could hear was the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was unsettling, too quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. Then, just as they reached a small clearing, Jack heard it. A sharp snap, the unmistakable crack of a branch underfoot. Someone was close. Too close. "Move!" Jack hissed, grabbing Walter's arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted across the clearing, Ace leading the way. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Behind them, he could hear the rustling of footsteps, quick and deliberate, like the movements of people who knew how to stay hidden. The trees blurred as they ran, branches slapping against Jack's face and snagging his jacket. Walter stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but Jack caught him and hauled him back to his feet. "No time to fall," Jack muttered, urging him forward. Ace darted ahead, his nose to the ground, searching for a path through the dense forest. Jack followed closely, trusting the dog's instincts. Walter stumbled behind, his breath coming in gasps, but he didn't complain. There was too much at stake now, too much to lose. They ran until their legs burned and their lungs ached, until the forest grew darker and the trees loomed like silent giants around them. Finally, Jack spotted a narrow ravine up ahead, the steep walls offering a temporary hiding place. "In there," Jack called, pointing toward the ravine. Walter nodded, gasping for breath as they scrambled down the rocky slope, their feet slipping on loose dirt. Ace leaped ahead, landing gracefully at the bottom, his tail wagging anxiously. Jack followed, dragging Walter with him as they tumbled into the narrow trench. "Stay low," Jack ordered, pressing himself flat against the cold earth. Walter did the same, clutching the notebook tightly against his chest. They lay there in silence, listening for any signs of pursuit. The forest above them was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Jack's heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay still, every muscle tense and ready. He strained to hear anything, footsteps, whispers, anything that would tell him their pursuers were near. Then he heard it. Soft footsteps, cautious and deliberate, moving along the edge of the ravine. Jack held his breath, motioning for Walter to stay silent. Ace huddled close to Jack's side, his ears twitching, but he didn't make a sound. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, as if he knew that silence was their only ally now. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just above the ravine. Jack's pulse raced, every second dragging painfully as he waited. Whoever was out there was standing directly above them, just a few feet away. For a moment, everything stood still. Jack could feel the tension in the air, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. He gripped the edge of the ravine, ready to spring into action if necessary. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, moving away slowly, fading into the distance. Jack let out a slow, shaky breath, his body sagging with relief. "I think they're gone," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure. Walter exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from his brow. "That was too close." Jack nodded grimly. "Yeah, but we're not out of the woods yet." He glanced down at Ace, who gave a small, encouraging wag of his tail. The dog seemed ready to move, eager to press on despite the danger. "We need to keep going," Jack said, his voice low. "We can't stay here. If they come back, we're trapped." Walter gave a weary nod, though his exhaustion was clear. Jack helped him to his feet, and together, they climbed out of the ravine, Ace leading the way once more. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whoever was following them wasn't going to stop until they found what they were after. And if Jack didn't figure out what that was soon, it might be too late, for all of them. The forest thinned as Jack, Walter, and Ace pressed onward, the looming shadows giving way to dappled light filtering through the trees. Their legs were heavy with exhaustion, but they kept moving, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. Ace still led the way, his movements purposeful as if he knew exactly where to go. After what felt like hours, the ground leveled out, and they reached the edge of a secluded clearing. In the center sat a second cabin, older and smaller than the first. Its roof sagged, and ivy crept up the sides, but smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, confirming that someone was inside. Walter's breath caught in his throat. "You think it could be Ryan?" Jack scanned the area, his eyes sharp. "Only one way to find out. Stay behind me." They moved cautiously toward the cabin, each step careful, as if the ground beneath them might shatter. Ace sniffed the air, his tail wagging slowly. Jack could feel the tension radiating off Walter, but they had come too far to turn back now. Jack approached the door and gave it a tentative knock, the sound echoing through the still air. For a moment there was nothing, just silence and the distant rustling of leaves. Then the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the doorway. It was Ryan. Walter let out a strangled gasp, his knees nearly buckling at the sight of his son. Jack held his breath, studying the man before him. Ryan looked different, thinner, his eyes sunken with weariness, but it was unmistakably him. "Dad?" Ryan's voice cracked, disbelief written across his face. "What are you doing here?" Walter stumbled forward, his voice choked with emotion. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, Ryan. I thought you were gone." Ryan's gaze shifted between Walter and Jack, confusion flickering across his face. He opened the door wider, stepping back to let them inside. "Come in. It's not safe out here." Jack exchanged a wary glance with Walter but followed Ryan into the cabin, with Ace trailing closely behind. Inside, the room was simple but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and blankets were neatly folded in a corner. Ryan sat down heavily in a wooden chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered. "They've been watching me. If they find out you're here..." Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Who's they, Ryan?" "What's going on?" Ryan's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "I don't know exactly who they are, but they've been following me for a while. Ever since I found out something I wasn't supposed to." Walter knelt beside his son, gripping his hand tightly. "What do you mean? What did you find out?" Ryan hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "It doesn't matter now. The important thing is that I stay hidden. That's why I had to leave. Why I left Ace behind. I knew he'd find someone to help, but I didn't think it would be you." Walter's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Jack, however, pressed on. "We ran into someone at the park, someone who's been following us. They're still out there, Ryan. We need to know what we're up against." Ryan nodded grimly, They want what I know. I've got files, documents, proof of what they've done. If they find me, it won't end well." Jack felt the weight of Ryan's words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. They were in deep, tangled in something far bigger than they had imagined. Ryan stood abruptly, walking over to a small wooden box on the mantel. He opened it, pulling out a bundle of papers and handing them to Jack. "Here, this is everything I have. Take it. You'll know what to do with it." Jack took the papers, flipping through them quickly. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at, but he could tell it was important enough to make Ryan a target. "What about you?" Jack asked. "You can't stay here forever." Ryan shook his head. "I have to disappear. It's the only way to keep you safe. If they think I'm still alive, they'll never stop hunting me." Walter looked devastated, clutching his son's arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Ryan. We can help you. We can fight this together." Ryan smiled sadly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing there are no easy answers. "I wish it were that simple, Dad, but I've already made my choice." Jack exhaled slowly, sensing that time was running out. "What's the plan?" he asked, already preparing himself for what came next. Ryan nodded toward a narrow path at the back of the cabin. "There's an old trail that leads to the river. You can get out that way without being seen. I'll leave after you're gone. We can't risk leaving together." Walter's face crumpled with grief, but he gave a small, reluctant nod. "I don't want to leave you again." Ryan's eyes softened. "You won't. I'll find a way to reach you once it's safe. I promise." Jack touched Walter's shoulder gently. "We need to go." Walter gave Ryan one last, tearful embrace, holding on as if he could somehow make up for all the years they had lost. Then, with a heavy heart, he pulled away. "Stay safe," Walter whispered, his voice breaking. Ryan gave a small nod, his eyes bright with unspoken emotion. "You too, Dad." Jack turned toward the door, motioning for Walter to follow. Ace gave Ryan a soft nudge with his nose as if saying goodbye, then trotted toward Jack, ready to leave. As they slipped out the back of the cabin and into the forest, Jack felt the weight of the papers in his pocket, a silent reminder of the truth they now carried. The trail ahead was narrow and winding, but Jack knew they had no choice but to keep moving. Behind them, the cabin grew smaller, fading into the shadows of the trees. Jack didn't look back. They had come for answers, and now they had them. But the real challenge lay ahead, staying alive long enough to make sure the truth saw the light of day. With Ace leading the way, Jack and Walter disappeared into the forest, their footsteps light but determined. This wasn't the end of the story, just the beginning of a new fight. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and consider subscribing to my channel. I work hard on these stories, and your support means a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.